Magnus Carlsen versus Jan Nepo. Legends of Chess 2020, Day 2, Game 1 of the finals. My name is Daniel Priya, and I was actually very excited to see that this game featured one of my favorite openings, the London system. So the game started with d4, Magnus Carlsen playing with the white pieces, knight f6, and knight f3. And here, Nepo played g6. And it's very interesting that Magnus Carlsen, knowing that Nepo was going for a system with g6, decided to play the London system bishop f4. So we're not going to spend too much time on the move order here, but of course, if you play the London system with bishop f4 move 2, then you'll have to play that regardless of whether your opponent plays d5, g6, e6, or a combination of those moves. Magnus Carlsen, knowing exactly what Nepo was going to play, in particular g6, decided to go for the London system. So he was expecting probably King's Indian defense, maybe a Grunfeld defense, although Grunfeld can also rise after d5 and move 2. But in this game, Nepo continued with the normal bishop g7, so once again not revealing his hand yet. Black can go d6 or d5 later on. And Magnus Carlsen played e3. Now, very important in these g6 systems, after black plays g6, white plays e3, locking this bishop outside the pawn chain, which is good in a way, knowing that this bishop is technically a bad bishop because it's the same color of the central pawns here. But at the same time, this bishop is controlling very important diagonal. However, now it's locked outside the pawn chain, and potentially, pretty much at any moment, this bishop can be harassed by a knight going to h5. So let's see what happens if here black decides to go knight h5 instead of castles, which was played in the game. So after knight h5, there's a very important pattern that you need to know. And first of all, here white has got two options, bishop g5 or bishop e5. Now the reason I'm saying this is because it's very important to understand why the players chose the particular move order that was chosen during the game. So here white can go bishop e5 or bishop g5. I'm just going to give a sample line now. Say bishop g5, very similar to what happened in the game, but only a few moves later. h6, bishop h4, and here if black tries to still chase this bishop with g5, knight f to d2 comes. So the queen is attacking the knight, so black could take the bishop, then the queen is taking this knight, and this is not really ideal for black because the structure will be kind of ruined. And after the knight goes back, the bishop goes back. Now the king side for black is ruined, and what's very important here is that first of all, white has not castled, so white can play h4 later on and attack on the king side. And also this bishop, if you notice, this bishop usually goes to e2 when the pawn is on g6, but because the pawn is no longer on g6, this bishop on d3 is actually very strong. And the bishop is still on f1, meaning white is not wasting any time. So that's why black usually doesn't play knight h5 in this particular position. But now let's see, after one move castles and a bishop e2, what happens if black tries knight h5 now? Well, now it's actually even worse. d6 was played in the game. So after knight h5, once again, white could go bishop e5, which is an option, and after f6, bishop g3, black is capturing this knight, but look at this file here, and also look at this diagonal. Not really what black wants. So normally this doesn't happen, but the alternative is bishop g5, which is also very interesting because here if black tries the same thing, once again, it's possible to retreat the knight, but even better here is to move g4 because black is already castled, and white is not going to castle now on the king side. And after the knight goes to f6, here bishop g3, and it would be absolutely insane for black to capture this pawn. It would be crazy. First of all, because potentially white could play knight g5 and get the pawn back, but more importantly, because after knight takes, here white is actually playing h4. Yeah, and this position is a big disaster for black. The king side is getting open completely. Game could continue with f6, trying to defend the g5 pawn, but after takes, knight has to go back. And here simply knight f3 back, and this is really a very simple attack for white. So definitely not what black wants. And if black doesn't capture on g4, still white will continue at some point with h4. Say, for example, d6, immediately h4 is coming as well. So this is why it's usually not a good idea for black to go knight h5 right now. After d6 though, then the story is completely different. In fact, after d6, the most popular move is h3. And the move h3 was not played in the game, which is interesting. Usually, h3 is played because now if white doesn't play h3, we'll see what happens, what happened in the game. And it's important to notice that if black goes d5 here, h3 is still possible, but it's only the second most popular move. The most popular move here is castles. And the reason is, right now, once again, this e5 square is available. After knight h5, one more time, bishop e5 is possible, bishop g5 is also possible. But say bishop e5, for example, you have the same thing, f6, bishop g3, and now to justify this pawn on f6, which is severely limiting the scope of this bishop, black would probably go e5. However, white can answer with c4. Once again, utilizing this diagonal that is now severely weakened. So this is just a possibility. The play is not forced here, but it's just to show why normally players just castle here. And once again, bishop g5 is perfectly possible here as well. However, after d6, usually h3 is played. And the reason is now this move is no longer possible. Bishop e5 is obviously no longer on the board because of d6 controlling e5. Magnus Carlsen decides not to spend a tempo with h3 and goes castles immediately. So Jan Nepomniachtchi decides to go after the bishop, knight h5, bishop g5, h6, bishop h4, g5, and here you're now already familiar with this pattern, knight back. Now note that in some lines, if this knight, the other knight, the b knight, is already on d2, this knight could go to e1, and we have the same idea. And as you've seen earlier as well, sometimes the bishop attacks the knight on h5, sometimes the queen attacks the knight on h5, it still works. Very, very important pattern to notice. At the same time though, once this knight retreats, there is an additional move that is not possible when the bishop is not on d2, and this move is knight f4. So it's important to know that knight f4 is a possibility here for black, saying, hey, I want to play with the bishop here. So if you don't want to give me the dark square bishop, then give me the light square bishop. And this move is something you need to be prepared for if you play this particular line, especially if you don't play h3 after d6. And here, normal is just to capture this knight, and now black has to capture the bishop. And this pawn structure is very sharp, a lot of different possibilities, probably starting with c3 is an idea to make sure d4 is protected. d4 is currently hanging. And later on, black's kingside can have some problems. So not a lot of black players like this line. Computers usually are quite happy in this line. They say it's about equal. But a lot of humans don't really like this line. And I remember asking this question to Garakamsky, probably the highest rated player who consistently plays the London system at any level. And he doesn't like this move either. So yeah, it's a possibility, but it's not extremely popular. Normally, black would just retreat with this knight on f6, and bishop g3 is normally played, and that's exactly what happened during the game. So this position was reached before, again, not extremely popular, because usually white plays h3 in these lines, but here Magnus Carlsen decided to go for this line, and now knight c6, and here white really needs to decide what to do with this knight. If this knight was still on f3, or maybe on e1, then this knight would normally go to d2. However, the d2 square is occupied by the other knight. So this knight really doesn't have any better option than going to c3. However, most of the times players go c4 first. And after c4, only then play knight c3. Magnus Carlsen decided to go knight c3 immediately. And Nepo answered with e5, so immediately striking at the center. And this position is very complex. A lot of different moves are possible. The move that was played before was knight b3. There was a game played in this particular line. d5 is also possible and leads to a very different type of game. And a few other moves are possible as well. But here, very sensibly, Magnus Carlsen just captures the pawn in the center. After which, d takes is also possible. This pawn might become a little bit of a target here. It's already attacked by the bishop. Maybe the knight in the future will attack it. It's limiting the scope of this bishop. And if black has to push this pawn, maybe it will become a little bit overextended. It's still a possibility, but Nepo decided to simply play knight takes, and this is more dynamic because now you can see that piece play is the main feature of black's position. And here Magnus Carlsen decides to go for a very, very sharp line, f4. And this position is already a mess. f4 is not really a typical move in the London system in this particular variation, but of course once the knight is on e5, it makes a lot of sense. After f4, Nepo decides to accept the challenge and just brings the knight to g4. And here, as you can see, the move f4 is definitely a very aggressive move, but at the same time, it's leaving a hole on e3. e3 is now very weak, so white needs to spend some time to defend this weakness. Rook f3, rook e8, attacking e3 one more time. Knight f1, defending e3. Knight h5. This move was played by Jan Nepomniachtchi. This move is not necessarily a mistake, but it is a very risky move. And the reason is, if you look at the position of these knights, they're actually very shaky. This knight on h5 is unprotected, and this knight on g4 can be chased at any time with h3. So knights usually like outposts. Knights usually like squares that are not only advanced in the enemy's camp, but also quite safe, maybe protected, and not so easy to be chased from. In this particular case, these knights are a little bit shaky, and this will be a feature of the position as it will become apparent later on. Bishop e1, of course, once again, this bishop's been chased for so long, still doesn't want to be exchanged for a knight, so the bishop retreats to e1. So the knight on h5 now is aggressive, but also looking a little bit silly, and we'll see why this becomes a problem for black. So after bishop e1, black plays this move f5. Excuse me. Now, believe it or not, this move f5 is already a losing blunder. And here, instead of f5, it would have been better to continue with g takes f4. And this position is probably dynamically balanced. It's actually a very sharp position. It's not so clear what's really happening. Computers say it's kind of balanced. But here, after e takes f4, for example, which looks like the best move, a lot of different moves are possible. So it's not really easy to assess that. Queen f6 is a very natural choice, putting pressure on this pawn. This pawn can be defended, but it doesn't have to. Bishop d2 is normal to defend the pawn, but there's no need to defend the pawn just yet because black is not really trying to take. But here, after, for example, bishop d2, queen d4 is a possibility. King goes to h1, only move. And again, it's a very dynamic position. A lot of different things could happen in this position. So this would have been the best possibility for black. And Magnus Carlsen was probably happy to enter that variation as well, because there were a lot of possibilities for each color. However, here, after bishop e1, f5 was played, and this move is a blunder, but it's important to understand why it's a blunder. So normally opening up this diagonal is very risky. It's diagonal against the king. However, if the king can just go to h8, then it's not such a big deal. So Magnus Carlsen played bishop c4 here. If the king could just go to h8, then black is, okay, it's a sharp position. Black, it's probably okay here. The problem, though, is that because this knight is on h5 and this rook is on e8, the f7 square becomes a target. And even if there is no pawn on f7, the bishop can still go to f7, forking the rook and the knight. And that is a big problem. That's why king h8 is not possible. So Nepo probably missed that. And therefore now, if king h8 is not possible, king h7 would actually lead to the same thing. Where's this king going? King f8 would be extremely risky because now this file is opening, and that would probably lead to a loss for black. So Nepo decided to play bishop e6. But the problem with this move is that this bishop was already performing a task, the task of defending this pawn on f5. So after this bishop is exchanged, this pawn becomes very vulnerable. And after h3, the knight goes back, white takes on g5, black takes, and the pawn on f5 is now lost. So that's why this f5 move was a blunder. And here g5 is also hanging, so black has to defend with bishop h6, and this position is just crushing for white. The game continued with g4 chasing the other knight. Knight has to retreat to g7. Now the rook comes back to f3. Very interesting idea, overprotecting the e3 pawn. This knight is currently defending this pawn, but now that the rook is also defending it, the knight can immediately jump somewhere else. So after queen d7, in order to bring the other rook into the game, knight g3 was played. Now this pawn is defended by the rook. And this position is very, very difficult for black. The rooks are doubled. Here comes bishop f2. Now, protecting this pawn with the bishop, freeing the rook from that task. Queen c6 was played, and here e4 pretty much seals the game. Now, after queen c6, there are some threats on the light square, on the light squares here in the center, but unfortunately for black, e4 just solves every problem. e4, now this pawn cannot be captured, of course, if knight takes e4. Now, white can actually capture with either knight. Say, for example, knight g takes e4, rook takes, knight takes, and here, say, queen takes, for example. If you have a quick look at the material here, black's actually in big trouble, because black is down the exchange. White potentially could even just go rook e3 and exchange one more piece, and this position is technically winning for white. So if this is impossible, that black's position is really, really difficult here. And therefore, Nepo tried knight d7. And you may be thinking, wait a minute, doesn't that allow knight d5? Now the problem is knight d5 is happening anyway. So even if this knight is still on f6, knight d5 is coming, and the knight can never capture, because after white captures back, this is a fork. So this knight is not really defending d5. As a matter of fact, after knight d5, then this knight becomes vulnerable. So Nepo decided to sidestep that and just go knight d7. But here knight d5 comes anyway. And here, interestingly enough, Nepo decided to resign. Now, technically, this is a win for white. And yes, probably it's slightly premature to resign in a rapid game in this position, as one of the commentators, Alexander Grishuk, pointed out. But what Grishuk said basically is that this just shows a lot of respect for Magnus Carlsen. And the reality is this is a winning position. So someone like Magnus Carlsen should be able to convert this really 100 times out of 100. In this position, there's a lot of threats. For example, rook c3 is coming, winning c7. If the knight capture on c7, this is actually a fork. Black is already down in material, and black is almost paralyzed, because this square is not available for the pieces. If rook moves, the knight is coming to f6 with a check, forking the king and the rook, and it's really, really difficult to find a constructive move for black. There's probably literally nothing to do. Maybe knight c5 could be tried, but the problem is that, you know, even just b4 here, and this knight might have to go back, and knight e4 obviously would be just desperation, because remember this square here in f6, black can easily get in trouble here. For example, captures, and here knight f6. It's not the only move, certainly one way to immediately win more material and ultimately winning the game. So here in this position, Nepo resigned, and I find this game extremely interesting. First of all, for the opening choice, if we just go back for a moment, this was a London system, and in particular, Carlsen wanted to play London system against g6. So it could have been a King's Indian, could have been a Grunfeld defense. It ended up being a King's Indian. And the second very interesting moment here, when Carlsen decides to play not the most popular move h3, but to play simply castles, not being afraid of this knight h5, and Nepo just accepts the challenge, goes for it. And this position is extremely sharp. Knight goes back to d2. So once again, if you play the London system against g6, you really need to be very familiar with this pattern. It's very, very popular. And here you need to be prepared for knight f4, which a lot of black players don't really like, as we mentioned, but it's a possibility. G takes h4 is also possible. It's by no means a mistake. G takes h4, and bishop takes. And once again, a computer might think this position is fine for black, but usually it's a little bit easier to play for white, because the king is here deprived of its natural shelter on g6. This pawn can become weak, but also black can play dynamically, maybe playing this pawn to h3 at some point, just to shatter this pawn formation in front of the white king as well. So it's a very sharp game. You want to be prepared for that as well. But the most popular move is just to retreat, and here pretty much anything can happen. Now the second very interesting choice, to play knight c3 without c4. This is a very interesting choice as well. So probably the third interesting choice of the game. First of all, to play the London system. Second, to omit h3 against d6. And third, to play knight c3. And later on, captures, f4. And here, white had to defend a little bit, but after the blunder, f5, bishop c4, and the game was soon over. It's a very interesting game played by the world champion Magnus Carlsen. And if you play the London system, or if you would like to start playing London system, this is definitely a very interesting game to watch and analyze. And I encourage you to just replay the game yourself as well. And if you'd like to find out more information on the London system, check out the links underneath these videos, because we do have a lot of content on the London system. This is Daniel Priya. Thanks a lot for watching this video. I'm looking forward to seeing you in the next videos.